Well, I'm an associative synesthete, so the colours flood my mind, but I don't see them in front of me. I associate numbers and letters and words with colour and music, and I adore music. And so the most pleasurable of them all is to hear music in colour. It's indescribably wonderful. I was born with it. I think the real question is when I realised that other people didn't have it. And I must have been really very young, because I can remember being in church in Sunday school. So I would have been about 5 years old. And a particular hymn was Yellow and Runny. And I opened my mouth to say this to a friend. And then I can remember thinking, no, that's only me. Other people don't hear it. So I don't know whether I've made a complete fool of myself. I probably had, going on about my synesthesia, my colour perceptions to others. But from certainly at the age of 5, I realised that this wasn't something that was common. My friends didn't share it. No, I mean, I was a child in the 1960s and a teenager in the 1970s. And at that time, it's my understanding now that psychology tended to focus on phenomena that could be generalized rather than oddities. I made a bit of a fuss of it in my teens as a sort of showing off, because I was a teenage girl. But the synesthesia itself, no, I think that was the only, those were the only occasions when I mentioned it. Other people didn't have it. And just to say, I was well aware that I had an extraordinary memory, and I would do party tricks, but it wasn't until my 30s that I had any idea that they were related, that was related to my synesthesia. I was in my 30s. I was driving a car around the North Circular Road, which is the orbital road around London. I was listening to the BBC's Radio 4, and there was a documentary, and they had this word, synesthesia. I couldn't even imagine how it was spelled. I mean, where does the sin come into it? But they were describing me. That was very strange. And they were talking about me and people like me, and we were suddenly these people. Now I'm white and I'm straight. I'd never been these people, and it's quite uncomfortable to hear oneself described as these people. And there were questions about, the first thing we have to do is make sure these people aren't just making it up. And that was where I discovered that a lot of us have extraordinary memories. And much more important to me, I also discovered that a lot of us have marked cognitive deficits, which is a posh way of saying we have laughable failings, that a lot of us, we don't know left from right, we can't find our way around, we spend much of our lives lost, we don't have any real understanding of spatial things, we can't work mechanical things unless we're shown, and of course we get laughed at for it. And it was only a few days later, I was driving a colleague somewhere in London, totally lost. This was in the days before sat-nav. I didn't have a clue where I was. And I can remember I heard myself say to him, I have no sense of direction. It's because I have something called synesthesia, and it's associated with these following gifts. And suddenly, it was something that I didn't have to be ashamed of. Yeah, my father, I was in my teens. And I don't know why, but I just couldn't have mentioned it, or I mentioned it and nobody noticed. And my father said to my mother, Jane has the same colour oddities that I have. And I didn't know. And I will have been about 14, 15. All the time. Every word I read colour. every scrap of music. I used to say that certain music didn't have any colour before I realised it was either black or white, and that's a colour. So everything around me, it's just part of who I am, so I don't stop and think about it. My first novel, the principal character had synesthesia, as did one of her neighbours. And the principal character, Annie, was a little girl, and her neighbour, whom she loved, was murdered. And what they had shared was their synesthetic experience. So I felt driven, inspired, I think driven really, to include that in my first novel. I had another synesthetic character, another synesthete in my fourth novel. That there was more of a reason, a different sort of rationale for that. That novel included Sibelius's Eighth Symphony, which he never finished, or at least he probably finished it and set fire to. And Sibelius himself had synesthesia, so that was a link between the principal character and Sibelius himself. Other than that, I suppose it probably influences my writing style. Somebody said I have a lot of colour, literally colour, I don't mean figuratively, but I tend to talk about colours in a lot of my writing, which I suppose isn't surprising since that's the world I live in. I suddenly realised I wanted the words Ruby Tuesday in the title. Ruby Tuesday hadn't actually been written in 1965, which is when the novel is set, but I already wanted an oddity that she would hear music that hadn't yet been written. Now, to me, Tuesday is ruby red. And the moment I realised that, I thought, it's about synesthesia. Ruby Tuesday, they both have synesthesia, Annie does, and the neighbour does, and it was as clear as day, and the whole of the rest of the plot fell into place. One of my friends was horrified that I was writing a book with synesthesia in it. He said, "Jane, this is odd. It's really odd. People aren't going to relate to that." But a lot of other people said, "Oh, well, I've always known that some numbers were masculine and some were feminine." I said, "Well, no, that's synesthesia." And other people saying, "Well, yeah, days of the week are in colour." And so to a lot of readers, I think they suddenly thought, "I've got that. I'd never put a name to it. Didn't know it was special." Oh, that is a difficult one. I think it would have more colour in it. Do you remember? Sure you do. Remember the book called Perfume, about a murderer. And there it is full of scents. It is full of smell all the way through. I think for a colour synesthete, to use colour all the way through and bind the plot somehow to those colours, that might be beyond my expertise, but that would be a wonderful thing to do. Well, they weren't, they should have been. At school, all the subjects I was good at involved this extraordinary memory that I had, and my creative gifts. So, and of course in science, having that sort of memory isn't really a lot of help. I mean, if I'd had acting ability and been an actress, I could have learned a part in no time at all. In the end, I'm glad I did, and science was a wonderful training for my mind, which could otherwise have been a little unruly, my imagination. But no, I went off along a path for which I was not really prepared, and it was good luck that in the end I did well in it. It was good luck rather than judgment. took me a long time to realize this. I can remember hearing some musicologists say that Wagner changed the colors and textures of music. Now, I'm not a Wagnerian, and Wagner doesn't have very much an effect on me, but I suddenly realized that the music that came after him has different colors and has texture. And nothing before Wagner, no music before Wagner has any texture. So I adore 20th century music. I love rock music. I love jazz. I love rap. And there are very few composers before Wagner that I love. Hip hop to me is white and black, and those aren't colors to me. So I think that sort of spoils hip hop. No, no. In fact, I'd started my book about Sibelius without and having loved him since childhood. I fell in love with him. Absolutely adore Sibelius's music. I didn't even realize he was a synesthete until I went to a synesthete conference in New York. And Sean Day, the organizer of it, and he and I were talking, and he said, well, of course, Sibelius was a synesthete. And I sort of went, yes, because that brought everything together in this plot that I was just beginning to work out in my mind. I would imagine perhaps he meant that the walls must be thin, since one sense is leaking through into another sense. For example, the sense of colour into the sound of music. And of course, he was such a wonderful writer. That is the sort of excellent imagery, I suppose, that one might expect from Nabokov. I'm a very, very great admirer of Nabokov. I am extremely sensitive to language, and it's a nuisance. I will be watching a drama on television or in a film set in the past, and there will be anachronisms in the language that they're using, and I will pick up on those instantly. And I mean, it's so sensitive that I will actually think that wasn't around in the 1930s. I first heard that on Sunday in November 1989 in Evanston, Illinois. It's literally, it's as bad as that. I think W.H. Auden had a poem in which he says he could hear his lover's voice in the thunder. Yes, I do that. In that poem, that voice is a deep black. And yes, I interpret sounds around me as being speech. Yes, I use a white noise machine to sleep if there's any noise going on, and I can sometimes hear words in it. Very, very slow writer. And I'm probably not the only writer who's terrified by the sight of a blank screen. I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I think a lot of us do. But when something has to be added and I have a blank screen, that's a terrible sight. And I'm very, very slow in filling that page. I don't know whether it was a talent, but at the age of must have been about 4.5, we start school early over here. And I wrote a story about a little boy called Tom, and he was going around and meeting ghosts and skeletons and all the things that I was interested in. Now, I don't suppose that story had any merit. The point is, I still remember it. I'm in my 60s. I still remember that story. And I think that probably defines a writer, not the quality of it, but the fact that it's of such importance as part of your identity. I learned to read and write as soon as I went to school. I don't remember learning to read or write. I can have a memory of being in the classroom with words written on a blackboard that I could already read. It's difficult for me to answer because I haven't experienced life as a non-synesthete. But I think perhaps metaphors might come more readily to us because our world is a metaphorical world and a different layer from the non-synesthetic world. So that's an additional confusion for me because Juliet is a rose because they're both the same color. So I think we have another layer for metaphors if we have synesthesia.